we offer a perspective that is based on so much international work and international work on the ground. And what I've found over the years is that tragically, most of the activists who end up fighting to protect the poor, to protect forests, to protect the lake, to protect the health of their community, to fight even for democracy, many of them tend to be focused within a national narrative, a national perspective. And I think this weakens our activism and our vision tremendously. So the paradox is that to become a really convinced localist, you generally need to have had quite a lot of international experience or to be very well informed about what's going on in other parts of the world. So it's also for many people, it's confusing. It's a paradox that we are arguing that we need international collaboration. And as I say, deeper cultural exchange, deeper information exchange from the ground up of what's going on. Because what we're really talking about is understanding that we need to rethink the economy from the ground up and from the human needs up, from an understanding of who we really are as human beings. Let me introduce Jeremy Lent, who I'm sure most of you have joined us know Jeremy and his very important work. He's now become, I would say, a leading thinker globally in exactly reframing our worldview to understand that we need to start with the living world, with life itself. We've been caught up in a mechanistic worldview for hundreds of years. For all these years, there have been people questioning that mechanistic view, very wise thinkers like Goethe and Steiner and so on. But really, Jeremy, where you got most of your sort of depth of wisdom was from the East. And as was also the case for me, am I right in thinking that you gained that deeper ecological perspective on life through your studies of Eastern thinking?
Yes, that is absolutely true. And that was the way in which I sort of found myself actually spending a number of years asking this question about where do all these ideas come from that we have received, and realizing how there are totally different ways to make sense of the world. And it was actually through the discovery of Buddhism and then actually Taoism that I began to see there are very, very different ways. But as I started to do years of not just in cognitive research, but embodied research, things like Qigong and the actual living into that sense of connectedness, I got to see that at the deepest level, what indigenous traditions are telling us, and what Buddhism and Taoism, and then even modern discoveries in system science are telling us, is that all of these assumptions that we assume about human beings and assume about the world and our dominant worldview are just plain wrong. It's not even like, oh, we don't like them and let's look for something else. They're just wrong. And we begin to realize there's a whole different way of experiencing our existence in terms of this deep interconnectedness, which basically in their different ways, all these traditions are pointing us to.
And I would argue, I'm sure you agree, that almost every spiritual tradition, including the core of the dominant religions, there is that truth of the interdependence and oneness of all life. So people have known that forever, but somehow we started being pulled away from nature herself, from life itself, literally physically removed. And we even were taught to become disconnected from our own bodies. So we weren't listening to our gut, to our soul, our heart, what we deeply knew was right. So yeah, this journey of going away from nature means we've become entrapped in a system that is literally anti-life. It's deadly.
Yes. Exactly. And, we can really trace that back, a lot of it, to this Western tradition. We now think of it, I mean, it's really like this global culture, this dominant Western culture. But it all basically can be traced to early modern Europe in the 17th century, in its modern form. And you can actually go deeper if you want to really get a sense, how did this all happen, to even ancient Greek thinking, because it was actually Plato and other ancient Greek thinkers who started to have this idea that somehow the soul, the human soul, was separate from the body and was this thing imprisoned in the body. And that actually there was this perfect dimension out there somewhere in some eternal dimension. And the world was this polluted, changeable place. So the sense of separation was there all the way back there. But really in early modern Europe is when it turned into a whole different level with the rise of the scientific revolution, which brought all kinds of positive things, but also almost the more positive benefits it brought, the more it seemed to confirm people's senses. Yes, nature really is a machine and we can just do with it what we want. And it led to these incredible imbalances we experience today.
And I also think we should, as I see it, when I look back and try to understand the writings of other people, I do think Maria Gimbutas is also a very important voice in all of this. So it looks like, step by step in Europe, we moved away from nature and from feeling embedded in, deeply respectful of nature's limits, deeply in an embodied way, as you said, recognizing our interconnectedness with life. So that's a sort of maybe the first step that we know of historically. She says, there's evidence that there were goddess-based, very feminine matriarchal cultures that were peaceful, that sustained themselves for thousands of years. And of course, my experience, even in 1975, of this ancient Tibetan culture in Ladakh, was that they had also been living on their own land, peacefully exploring, developing, changing, but not through expansionism, not through thinking that they as a culture had the right to become a civilization and expand beyond their boundaries to essentially exploit and dominate and steal from other cultures. So I think there's a vision here for me of allowing cultures to flourish. And this is why we are adamant about the need to decentralize or localize, to allow people to develop a deep knowledge of their place. And what's so exciting is that in our work, having experienced how well that can work in an ancient culture, seeing the new examples of what I think of as re-indigenization. And it's particularly around the area of food and farming that we're seeing this flowering of nature and people. And sometimes within a magically short period, just right here in my area now, just in 3 years, what 3 young people did with 2 acres of land, and how it became a beacon of a thriving, healthy community with young people loving a bit of physical work, loving that every day when you're growing food, the work is different when you're in a healthy, diversified, localized system.
Exactly, Helena. And something I wanted to say that really struck me in the film that just launched is this recognition of that we think, or like the dominant culture tells us, that we have to be globalized in order to feed the world, and all these kind of comments. And it's so powerful how it shows how insane this whole global system is. I mean, there were some statistics, and I felt I understood this myself fairly well, but I was like shocked when I discovered about how they actually catch shrimp in Scotland. They ship it 6,000 miles to Thailand just so it can be peeled and then shipped back to the UK to be sold. And how a country like Germany turns out to be the second largest exporter of milk and the second largest importer of milk. So this system is not designed for human health. It's not designed for us to actually optimize our lives. It's designed so corporations can basically make more and more profit at the expense of the rest of us.
And I think it's so important now that we realize that the winners in this crazy global economy. So remember, when we critique globalization, we are in no way critiquing global, collaboration, understanding, cultural exchange, travel. We are talking about an economic trajectory where we, as we said, we went step by step further from nature. And as Jeremy was saying, a very clear breaking point in the 1700s in Europe, when a few men, it's a patriarchal system. Yes, they were white men, they were racist, they were misogynist, they literally, imposed slavery, genocide, in order to enrich themselves. Now, today, let's remember that we're in a system where it's absolutely counterproductive to blame all white men or to think that all women of color are virtuous. We have to be clear about the fact that, yes, it was a patriarchal system started by men who were clearly white and very racist, very misogynist. But let's wake up to the fact that this system from the 1700s on entrapped all of us in a path that was destructive to others and to ourselves.
Yes.
And we have all contributed to it. We have all contributed to it. And even today, when we look at how these global corporations are amassing absolutely obscene amounts of wealth, as we speak, by the second, this algorithmic financial casino is creating also out of just thin air money, but distributing it in a way that empowers and enriches global corporations that cannot respect nature, cannot respect us and our needs. And it doesn't respect the people inside that system either. So the people inside these corporations are not very different from you and me. And I so plead with people not to join those voices now at the grassroots who assume that everyone in power, in government, in corporations are greedy, evil people who are perfectly conscious of what they're doing. What I'm seeing is that we've all trained into a mechanistic, over-specialized view. No one has been briefly stepping back to look at the system. And I love working with you, Jeremy, because I feel you so share this worldview.
Yeah. It's such an important point that you raised there, Helena. And it's complex because what you have happening, and it was interesting actually, because I was just yesterday giving a presentation to a global group of companies that are basically based on the idea of sort of doing well by doing good. These are companies that want to be sustainable. And the whole conference is about how can we be more sustainable, but it's within the corporate system. And so I was actually giving them this presentation about how the problem is actually capitalism, is this actual system itself. And we need to recognize that corporations are in their single-minded obsession with profits. If they were actually persons, the way they're meant to be persons in the United States, where they actually have a say in politics and all that stuff, would be considered as psychopaths. And yet, to your point, the people who work within corporations are caring people who want to do well in the world. And it's a conundrum because many people in those corporations, they want to improve things. And so they'll try to, pressure to do things that involve a greener way of reducing fossil fuels or reducing this or that. But then they come up against this ultimate, oftentimes unspoken barrier that the whole reason for the corporation being there in the first place is to make as much money as possible. So it's a tricky place because we can't just assume away corporations. They dominate virtually every aspect of our global economy today. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, believe it or not, 69 of them are not countries. They're actually these for-profit corporations. So somehow we have to let people from within those corporations recognize they're part of a system that is designed to essentially suck the life out of the earth, but then try to work within it, but also look at ways in which the very system itself can be changed so they're no longer having to be part of that kind of machine.
Well, I think it's so important there that we understand that the reason we are facing more and more serious crises in the last 30 years, most people looking around the world will not deny that. What they're not looking at is the structural path whereby governments were handing over more and more power to these corporations, blindly believing that more global trade is in our interest. I'm going to enrich my country by signing on to these trade treaties, which include giving corporations the right to sue governments if they do anything to protect the environment or to protect workers' rights. It's a complete insanity. It makes a mockery of democracy. So we need to be looking at that trajectory of these global trade treaties where governments have signed away their right to corporations. We, as citizens, voters, need to be demanding that they get back around the same tables to do exactly the opposite, to start regulating global business. And it's very important that we also look at the need to deregulate local business and even sometimes national industry. Because what's been happening is that every place-based individual like you and me, every business within the national arena is squeezed for taxes and squeezed with ever heavier, more bureaucratic, more insane, and really frustrating regulations. This is one of the main reasons of the swing to the right. Demagogues come on the scene and say, we're going to grow the America, and we're going to grow America for you. We're going to make America great. We're going to make Hungary great. We're going to, in virtually every country, the swing to the right represents a rejection of big government without any discussion about the much bigger problem of a big conglomerate, almost a de facto empire of corporations and banks. So, the journey starts with awareness. That's what we're trying to do with this film, to start a discussion. In every country, the approach may be different, but at the international level, taking control of these corporations, it's pretty clear how that has to happen. But it will only happen with a citizens' movement. And what we hope for is that those who are already active in climate issues, with poverty, critiquing capitalism, that all these groups will come together with clarity about that global trajectory.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is what is so important, is to recognize that actually it's not even enough to just focus on what I'm doing or just what I'm doing in my local community. That is essential. And that's like a starting point. And that your film does such a great job of showing the power of that. But it's so important to also realize that we are part of this globally interconnected system that is designed to destroy life on Earth, basically, at a faster and faster rate, and certainly to suck the life out of our human well-being, to turn us into kind of consumer zombies. And once we realize that, we can begin to join forces with others around us. Because honestly, I sense the only way in which we're going to see that deep systemic transformation that is our only hope for a long-term flourishing future is as things as the contradictions of the system get to be worse and worse. And as we're seeing is happening right now, as things start to unravel, we have to really get people to understand that they together are the most powerful force there is. So when I see movements like Extinction Rebellion setting up groups around the world and beginning to get people to take notice, we don't know if XR themselves are the movement that's going to make all these transformational changes to happen, but they're doing the right thing. They're moving us in the right direction because we need to share with others. We need to actually get the power. It's not a matter of getting those in power to change their minds and do things different. It's bringing the power down to our grassroots, connected around the world, and letting the power itself shift towards life-affirming movements.
I think if people could keep in mind that the propaganda around economic globalization was that it was making the world more interconnected. Keep the image in mind that what it was doing was making children around the world dependent on McDonald's and Coca-Cola.
Mhm.
In the meanwhile, what that trajectory has done is to destroy our dependence on the universal interconnected web of life. So our genuine and real dependence on the water, on the soil, on healthy air, on a functioning, interdependent Gaian universal ecosystem. When we live a more place-based economic life, we are in tune with what the water needs, with what the trees need, what that incredible and infinite diversity of life needs, and how we can work with that and be part of it. I do want to say, I think one of the most important issues today to discuss is the further development of AI, particularly AI in technology. And I would urge people to be critical, even of moving into 5G, which is linked to driverless cars, to all kinds of consumer products we don't need. And for us to have clarity about using these technologies for communication, but not for economic exploitation. Now, it needs a lot of discussion about how we're going to do something about that. But please don't fall into the trap, as many people do in the West, of saying technology is neutral. It isn't neutral. Certain technologies have been created only with a profit-making motive in mind, in order to extract more wealth for the few at the expense of the many. They are global systems that suit that extraction. And we need to be very savvy and very aware of, again, starting to shift the system in service of life, in service of our needs, human needs, and the needs of nature.
Exactly.
So I think that's another big discussion, but
yeah,
I hope we'll, yeah.
That's
Go ahead.
absolutely true, Helena. And I'm seeing that we have some really great questions in the Q&A. If you like, we can move towards exploring some of those questions that are being asked. Let me just start maybe with a question that Mark Dwartson asked, which is a really great, challenging question. He says, the film does a great job of showing the multiple benefits of local food systems. Given the key role that energy plays in the global economy and international relations, how do you envision a localized energy system taking shape and improving our quality of life?
Well, for us, it's very, very clear. We've worked with decentralized renewable energy systems in Ladakh, Bhutan, Nepal, actually, and in connection with lots of groups around the world. What started happening as things went more and more towards the electronic systems, they took the power out of countries, whole countries like Bhutan and so on, from making their own systems. And we ended up having ridiculous things like even importing metal poles for the electric wires, from Japan. There are plenty of trees that they could use. And so, again, there is absolutely no doubt that renewable energy, when adapted to genuine human needs, in other words, our needs for cooking, heating, cooling, would look completely different. We would need a fraction of what we're told we need. We are told we need more and more energy. Why? Because we're locked into allowing the corporate research, the corporate narrative to dominate. And what we're locked into is producing more and more energy to produce more and more products, consumer products, with built-in obsolescence. There are now, Apple phones and so on that are made so that you cannot use a screwdriver to repair it yourself. So we really need to look at that difference and be a little bit skeptical about some of the microgrid systems being introduced to Bangladesh and so on. I know that systems could be introduced there that would be genuinely much more decentralized.
Yes.
And let's be very skeptical also of the renewable energy path, which is the big Green New Deal for big corporations, where solar panels are being plastered along thousands of acres of land, again, to generate the energy for this consumer culture with its waste and pollution.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. These are great points, Helena. And I think this whole question of energy gets to exactly what you were just saying before about technology not being this thing that's value neutral. In fact, the technology you use has deep embedded political and power orientations to it. And this is almost like a battle that's going on right now regarding renewables. I mean, there's this fantastic way in which renewables can be used to absolutely decentralize the grid, to put power back to grassroots communities all around the world in ways that have never even happened ever before in the past. So you can have a little village out in sub-Saharan Africa, which can have electricity for the first time just with panels on their roofs, not be part of a grid, not to have to rely on something out there, but actually be empowered to do things. Or you can have these massive systems. And even here, not even looking at the global south, even here where I am in Berkeley, California, in the Bay Area, you'd think that this would be a progressive place where, of course, the utility companies would encourage solar panels. There's plenty of sunshine in California. Actually, the monopoly company here, which is a for-profit company, PG&E it's called, is doing everything it can to stop people from actually putting panels on their roof. We're not even talking about subsidizing the panels. We're talking about they're trying to penalize people for actually creating their own energy, saying, oh, we've invested all this infrastructure and we're not going to be able to earn our returns. These are the kinds of things going on. That's why the issues have to be dealt with systemically as much as they're dealt with from our actual actions by ourselves. So,
and that also means being willing to look at the bigger picture, to really delve a bit deeper beyond the mainstream narrative in academia, in the media, and virtually every avenue of knowledge has been shaped more and more in the last 35 years by big money. And we have to start looking now at how that path of big money funding research and funding the development of infrastructure has taken us in precisely the direction that enriches the few at the expense of the many. Exactly. And let's remember, the few are getting fewer and fewer. It's a smaller and smaller number. So we, the 99%, are sort of mugs if we don't wake up to this and say, wait a minute, we want some justice here. We want some real equality here.
Exactly.
Are you seeing more questions?
Yes, I am. And let's move on to this question from Jack Strasbourg, who's basically talking about how he feels like, over these last few decades, we haven't progressed anywhere near what he was expecting. And he's asking if that's true, if we agree with that, and whether we're going to progress more rapidly in the future. And he kind of raised this question of this acceleration of our sort of global consciousness. And then finishing with this great quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who said, if we want peace, we need to learn how to organize as well as those who want war. So raising really important questions there. So I don't know if you want to just start talking about that, Helena.
Well, actually, can you repeat the first part of that question?
Sure. So the first part was whether we agree that we have not progressed anywhere near what we might have expected in the last few decades towards the transformation we need, and whether it's a likelihood that we can actually move faster in that direction and actually make the progress at the speed we need to now.
Yes, I have to say that at a certain level, I think we have progressed so much more than we realize. So that I'm constantly, almost every day, I'm getting information from more small-scale local community initiatives that even go up to some cities having made changes. The pressure from the bottom up has led to local governments making changes. So there is so much reason to have faith in humanity, to have faith in the human desire for peace, for connection, for love, as we say, and as Jeremy also says in our film. So we have made progress. However, it's just this huge fork in the road now where this tiny proportion of people are allowed to dominate so much. So I would argue that for that majority, it's the majority that has shifted. There's been a cultural shift towards deep respect for the indigenous, towards the feminine, for nature at every level. Even projects like bringing in a dog into an old people's home, or recently horses into prison, where human beings can connect with some animals. Even these projects are part of a bigger picture of us longing to reconnect with nature. And there's a huge cultural transition.
Exactly.
So for us, the big need right now is for us to step back and look at the bigger picture and see how this all fits together into this bigger picture. And whether the best language is as a symbol, global versus local, or monoculture versus diversity, or monoculture versus plurality. These systemic parts have many aspects to them. Maybe the key difference is what we talked about earlier. If you really analyze what's going on, what's being pushed by rules and regulations and economic pressures, that's robbing us of time. That's one of the most frightening things. We're running so fast, we don't have time to step back and say, I thought the economy was growing. Why am I getting poorer? What's going on here?
Right.
That's not happening enough. There's not enough focus on that techno-economic prism. I think once that happens, I think we'll just see a floodgate open and huge change.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is so true, Helena. And really one way to think about those kind of deeper interconnections that are taking place is if you think about an ecosystem and you're in the forest and you walk in the forest and you can see the trees standing up there. And what you're not aware of is that mycorrhizal fungal network under the ground that the trees are using to communicate with each other. And so the whole forest basically is in connection with each other, but you don't know about it when you're just looking at what's above. Similarly, when we look at the media every day, we see the terrible things going on, and we see the wars and the celebrity scandals that the whole system is designed to use to condition us, to sort of numb us from what's actually happening. But meanwhile, the deep connections that are being made are ones that are incredibly profound, but you don't read about every day, but we feel them. And we sense them. And that's why things like this film are so important, because they help people to recognize that we are part of this global movement, which, in Paul Hawkins' words, when he wrote that book, Blessed Unrest, is really the largest movement that's ever taken place among humanity. And I think we can give it a name. It's like, I think of it as a movement toward a life affirming civilization that people increasingly are calling an ecological civilization. This sense of, imagine redesigning our civilization all the way from the ground up, but in a way that nature itself designs its own ecosystems, one based on deep connectivity, on exactly starting from that grassroots, and one that's basically based above all on mutually beneficial symbiosis, where we're all doing our thing. We're actually living our lives for our fullness, and we're doing it as part of something bigger. So we're actually being symbiotic with others around us. That's what we actually see happening right now. And where I get some degree, I look oftentimes at what goes on, and I will get just as distraught as anybody at seeing how disastrous things seem to be getting and how much worse and worse at a faster and faster rate. But here's what gives me a sense of the possibility. Like, imagine that you're looking at a rug that's woven really tightly, and you don't like the pattern. You're trying to change it, but you can't really begin to tear it because it's tightly so woven. But then imagine that rug begins to unravel, just as our global system is unraveling. So every time as it unravels, the strands that connect all these things in this other system begin to get looser. So it's like we can reweave the system from within. So as things begin to fall apart in this society, not that I want them to fall apart, each time these bad things happen, human beings, animals, the rest of the living earth suffers. It's not what I want, but the positive thing that arises from that is the opportunity begins to emerge for us to reweave, because people all around the world get to see, especially younger people as they're growing into their teens and 20s, they see this system sucks, it doesn't work. And they look at what's going on and they're looking for different ways of being. That's where the hope lies for a crescendo of change, a phase transition, which oftentimes can happen when they're least expected and happen in a nonlinear way. And
I would just add to that it's possible that the end station will be a multitude of ecological cultures rather than one civilization. But whatever we call it, because I know, Jeremy, you're thinking of the one civilization as consisting of these many local and diverse ways of doing things.
Yes.
And I think why I do still like to use the language of local is that what we're offering people is, first of all, the opportunity to reconnect at the local level as a fundamental step towards healing. Please remember that the Alcoholics Anonymous has been so successful because people healed together as a joint journey. They felt part of a human group. This is one of the major ways that we've been pulled away into this prison of false ideas, anti-life ideas that make us unhappy, that created epidemics of depression and right now trauma all around the world. So the trauma that we're all feeling at different levels, the best and most important, and again I see it working, is when we come together in a group, ideally intergenerational, but ideally near where you live. And what adds to that is when you link that to a spiritual reawakening to nature. So there are countless projects now where, fathers and sons are taken out to camp in nature and to reconnect with each other and with nature. This is healing. And this is the local foundation building of becoming human again. It's how we evolved. Then, as you build on that and you start creating, and we would argue that food systems are the number one priority above energy, above everything else. As you start rebuilding those local food systems, you're also becoming part of really productive, meaningful, real economic exchanges with the real economy. And then when you build from that, you're starting to build the cornerstone of what ultimately is that ecological world that we all long for, and that world of peace, and a world that does genuinely use the care, the love, the sense of belonging in the way that we evolved to do it. We are animals connected to the rest of life. We have hands, we have legs, we have muscles, because we were meant to be genuinely productive in a multitude of ways, not a one-dimensional, isolated individual behind a screen. So we can make changes.
And in fact, what you're talking about, Helena, also relates a lot to another great question that Amanda Pat had, which is, she asked what efforts might be happening to relocalize spirituality. And I felt that you're really going in that direction as you were just talking there. So do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, how about you saying something about that? Because you were talking about the embodied.
Right, because I think that's what is so wonderful, is to realize that really our whole dominant culture tells us that spiritual and material are separate from each other. And so if you think about, what you're working on, that's totally different from spiritual. And part of this, really this reconnection with our deep interdependence, is to realize that spirituality itself is really this orientation towards the connections between things. And that can be land-based spirituality, which, of course, so many people are recognizing that indigenous traditions around the world have been living that way for millennia, and that there's so much to learn from them now. And so many of them, even though they've been almost destroyed by these centuries of colonialism, have had the resilience to maintain these traditions. And now they're beginning to get to be seen again. And people around the world are beginning to give them the respect that they had been devastated for all these centuries of colonialism. And there's other elements of spirituality. And I think that's the notion that the spirituality is really this exploration each of us has in how we connect within our bodies, how we connect with each other, and how we connect with all of Gaia, and how we connect with the universe itself, the reverence for the universe itself. Some of us are discovering that through these pathways that we talked about earlier, that I I myself took through discovering Buddhism or Taoism or whatever they might be. Some of us just simply by reconnecting with nature, because and you don't have to be, it's great if you can be in the wilderness and feel the vastness of it, but we can also reconnect. Even a little backyard, we can reconnect with nature, because every little shoot that grows up has life within it. And our life within ourselves, our animate being, our animate consciousness can connect with that. And so we don't have to sort of wait until the opportunity to get to the great outdoors. Nature is ourselves, and life is all around us waiting to be noticed again.
And this is also, you see this difference from, again, the dominant Christian path that, as you were saying earlier, made life seem like dirty, and moving away from the body, from the earth, into this pure white, sky, and this, absolute separation between the spiritual and the material, this embodied spirituality, which takes us back to feel essentially the oneness, which in Christianity too, they talk about God is one, God is love. I think that one of the ways to think of this sense of oneness is to think of love as the uniting energy, what connects us. And well, there's so much to say about it, but right. The path towards more embodied spirituality is being spelled out in various ways. One of them also is that now in the sort of advances in studying our brains, our whole neurological system, we're actually seeing that when we learn to shut down the chattering left mind and just rest in a more balanced state, we actually are seeing flows of well-being in people's bodies, the hormonal flows, the serotonin, the oxytocin, the vagus nerve, all of that now is pointing to us training ourselves to take deep breaths, to be in the here and now, and it's a balancing within our bodies as we start reconnecting with that truth.
Right. Yes. And I'm just noticing such wonderful synchrony between each of the different topics you're raising and these Q&A questions and themes that are coming up, because I do feel we are, so many of us are looking at the same underlying insights from each of our unique perspectives. And so just to follow up on that, to follow the kind of arc, Donna Nellam asked about, she actually was talking about Ian McGilchrist's recognition of the left and right brain functioning, and about how the right brain helps us to integrate and connect and co-create and truly collaborate. So she was asking, can you share your perspective on ways we can develop collaborative capability in the context of the new, local, and interconnected work that's needed to rebalance society?
Well, again, I would say that one of the most important steps is to try to connect in these local face-to-face groups. So if all of you, excuse me, coming away from here, made a commitment to say, okay, I'm going to try to reach out to between 3 and maybe up to even 20 colleagues, friends, family, who would be interested in pursuing precisely that thinking. What we're saying is that we have a package of materials, films, thinking that point in the direction of how you can heal yourself and regain a sense of well-being, reduce your trauma through that personal interconnection, while you start exploring a bigger picture that shows you that this is the foundation of that localizing, reconnecting path that is going to heal the planet. So here is a way of looking at the world where you can feel that the personal healing and the planetary healing are completely linked. You can actually contribute also to this localizing path on the other side of the world by supporting genuinely circular economic development. Beware of the ways that people are thinking that by helping poor people, whether in our own countries or abroad, they're often helping them just to get a leg up to compete in the dominant, very speedy, completely corrupt global economic system. Even in your local town, the Walmart benefits from all of these supports from government. In the meanwhile, the small shop selling local food or handmade articles has a very hard time surviving. Localization, economic localization, is about beginning to reconnect the production and the consumption, even where the resources come, beginning to shorten, to create economic relationships that conform with the needs of people and nature. And that means smaller scale, it needs to be subjugated to social and ecological parameters. I hope that makes sense.
Yes.
Please do look at our writings. Yes,
Yeah,
Jeremy.
that sounds so great, Helena. And then I would add also thinking a little bit in terms of the way in which we connect, and maybe moving more towards that kind of spiritual aspect of that question of collaboration. I think what is so crucial is to realize that, and those of us who see what's needed to be done are still clearly in the minority, we're only too well aware of that, but not to see those people who are part of that dominant culture as being like the other. And even people who might actually be voting for the right-wing political parties in all the different countries that we're in right now, rather than seeing them as the enemy. By doing that, all that happens is actually we even increase the divisions that actually only lead to reinforcing the very values of separation that they're standing for. So it's as if what we need is like the sense of a love army, or like a revolution of love, because what we really need to do is we have to connect with people's life affirming qualities within them. And oftentimes we're not going to change people's minds in one conversation. We're not going to, and if we try too hard, we'll actually just get the barriers going up in the other person anyway, and end up maybe even losing ground rather than gaining anything. But it's when we actually connect with people's hearts, when we get people to actually, when we look at the deeper layers, and we realize when people are arguing against these things, it's because of their conditioning. It's because of suffering within them that they're not able to connect with these places. And reaching that and connecting with their humanity is the way in which I feel the transformation can take place, because it's only going to be when it's a transformation of true deep connectivity that we can actually have a chance to move forward in a better way.
And we have such beautiful examples from the localization movement of prisoners who've been allowed to join a community project where they're helped to listen to each other and to have the real encouragement to communicate in a completely different way, which is from the heart, which means that they're able to be vulnerable. They're able to talk about their fears. They're able to talk about the problems they had, because in the dominant culture, we've been trained from schooling onward to try to seem perfect, to be competing. We've not been allowed to be imperfect. We've not been allowed to be human, because we've been living up to the standards that have been set, standard, mechanistic, external standards of who we're meant to be. So as we come together in these local groups and we're able to be imperfect and to share, particularly these days, most people feel a lot of trauma, but even sharing our deeper joys, coming from that deeper level, it's a conversation that's completely different from the typical cocktail party thing. Oh, what new project have you got, and what important thing are you doing? And I'm so important because I've, got a PhD, or I've got a new car, or whatever. So as you start communicating on that human level, and you help and encourage projects and initiatives where other people can do the same in these human scale groups, that's a formula, as I say, that Alcoholics Anonymous has proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that really works. And the spiritual awakening that comes when we're able to feel connected to others is as important as the internal reconnection when we meditate and we get that balance with the right brain. That's fundamental. That many people have thought, I just have to work on inner peace, then there'll be peace in the world. No, it's a new human relationship that's needed to genuinely feel, and of course with nature.
Right, exactly. It's this multi-level of transformation within ourselves, within our connections, and within all of life. And I'm just noticing we only have a few more minutes left towards the end of the hour. And perhaps the question maybe that we should plan to end on, really big question asked by Michael Goldstein, who's asking, what do you think about raising our sights to building a movement for a nonviolent but real revolution? He says, I envision one aimed at real democracy and being built in the course of localization initiatives and continuing to build the necessary protests, pressures, resistance, which I think is a great question to finish on. I don't know if you want to have any words on that, Helena.
I do. I'll try not to be too long-winded. I agree. I mean, that's why we call the film A Quiet Revolution.
Yes.
It is a revolution, but we want it to be completely peaceful. We want it to be born of the wisdom to understand that the sort of anger and demonizing the other is not the way forward, that we want that movement to grow out of compassion, which very often starts. Again, I want to come back to that local healing in a group, because most of us in the West have not had enough love and nurturing. We've been in these nuclear families. We're all a bit neurotic. The healing that comes through that group work can help us to feel more compassion for ourselves, and with that, more compassion for others. So absolutely, I completely agree. That's what we need. And I think we also need clarity about how the system went so wrong. As I was saying earlier, greater clarity all the way up to those global arrangements and trade treaties. Sadly, even the climate treaties have been shaped by corporations. There's sometimes a bit of a shocking awakening when we realize how duped we've been. But then once we understand that the people who are doing the duping have also been duped, then you start seeing this just layer upon layer of false assumptions.
Right.
Some of the biggest right now are very well-intentioned people who believe we must have more technology to feed the world. It's being fueled now by the war in Ukraine, with these Africans starving. No one is talking about the truth of helping those people to develop healthy, thriving local food systems where the first priority is to feed themselves. So we have to be willing to rethink a lot of assumptions. And yes, build that peaceful, loving, and build it rapidly, that revolution. We can't wait too much longer. Jeremy.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I am just so with you in that, in exactly how you're describing it. I think what is crucial to recognize is that the changes that are needed are deep, deep systemic changes. The word that I keep coming to again and again, the word revolution for so many people in the mainstream is so scary. It's one thing if it's a quiet revolution, but if it's a real revolution, hey, no. But I love the word transformation. And it's maybe because I come from a systems perspective. What we need is a transformation of the entire system. And absolutely, it not only did it need to be nonviolence to avoid violence, but it's because the transformation itself is the very dynamic that then creates the new system. So when we're transforming it based on love, when we're transforming it based on connection, we're actually creating a new system from within that is actually one that could allow a completely different way of living. But I think we have to look really hard at recognizing so many of the so-called fixes and improvements are just basically maintaining the dominant system the way it is. We need deep systemic change. We need what I call deep transformation. And that's the only way we're actually going to shift the trajectory we're on right now.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I love working with you. And I like, before we leave, just to honor my dear friend, Joanna Macy, whom I've known for 45 years and whose work is a profound contribution and a global contribution. Her work that reconnects, that has been about reconnecting people to each other and people to nature, is a fundamental part of this movement. I'm very sad she couldn't join us today. I'm sure most of you are familiar with her work and appreciate her work. But if you don't know about it, be sure that you look her up. She's one of the great voices in the world today.
Yes.
And I'm very honored to be her friend. And I know, Jeremy, that you also know her. And thank you all for coming. And Henry and Carly, who've been helping in the background, thank you very much too.
Yeah.
And I hope you'll come to our website, localfutures.org. I hope you will take the time to organize maybe a community screening of our film, to start that bit of a discussion. It's been a way that people have used our materials in the past, like the Economics of Happiness film, to start getting action in their local community. So it's a very good tool for helping that deeper, broader discussion towards transformation. I think I prefer the word transformation to, or quiet revolution.
I love quiet revolution.
Go with that as well. We'll go with that as well. Yeah. Thanks again to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena, for making all this happen. Yeah.
Thank you.